This is a response video to the YouTuber Shaun on his video about the bell curve.
Hi, you're about to see a response video to Shaun and his supposed debunking of the bell curve from a long-retired YouTuber that I decided to host on my channel, so I didn't exactly make this video, but it was good enough that I thought it would be a good idea to include it on my channel. As with regards to my absence, I apologize as I'm working for 45 hours a week, so I don't exactly have enough time to write a script, voice myself, and then edit the video, but eventually I will quit the job and produce more videos on YouTube as I used to way back in 2020 and 2021 when I was in the university. At the same time, while temporarily being off YouTube, I've been really active on Twitter, and I'm now working on part 2 for my ideological manifesto, which will hopefully be released on Substack by the end of this month. I call it the Phenomenology of Progress, which is an ideology by which a general system theory, evolutionary, Nietzschean, and social conservative principles are all combined with a vision for a better structure of government, markets, technology, legitimacy, and other social phenomena. It is much bigger than my original video on YouTube, both in terms of its intellectual quality of arguments, but also in terms of the scope of the topics that are covered. It is going to be ahead above practically every other video or thing I have ever done in my career, so you definitely don't want to miss this out. So please subscribe to my Substack to be notified for its upcoming release and enjoy the video, and if it goes well, I'll probably release another response video to some other leftist that you want me to respond to, only speaking myself this time.
As you might expect from a response video, this video will be critical in nature. I'd like to state up front what my general position is on everything regarding this book in terms of the science and the associated social and political implications. My position is basically identical to Sam Harris. I think the science and politics can be treated completely separately. If the bell curve was presenting a fairly accurate account of the science of IQ in 1994, which I believe it was, arguments could be made for both politically conservative or liberal positions. The data could be used to argue for the end of many social welfare programs as suggested in the book, or it could be used to expand them. After all, whatever proportion of IQ is due to nature or nurture, no one is responsible for their own IQ. Having an IQ below 80 is arguably a disability, and arguments could be made that people with such low cognitive ability deserve a degree of help from society. So while I know that defending a book such as this will be construed by some viewers, such as fans of Shaun, as giving cover to racists with bad intentions, or at the very least providing cover to what you may consider to be regressive political agendas, none of these objections will make the science covered in this book any less true. And that is my main claim, that the presentation of the science of IQ in the bell curve was basically accurate. Although the bell curve makes no strong claims on innate or immutable differences in intelligence between ethnic groups, it does leave the door open to this possibility. Believe me when I say I do not relish or hope for this outcome. Personally, I don't want this data to be true. To paraphrase something Sam Harris said to Ezra Klein, what a relief it would be if I knew that ethnic groups had exactly the same potential for cognitive ability, and we had a path forward where all of these gaps could be addressed by leveling the field of environmental influences. But even if that were true, the differences in cognitive ability within ethnic groups is something with important social implications in itself, which is mainly what this book is about. So now that you know where I'm coming from and you're still watching, I'll tell you what I think of Shaun's video. While Shaun does make a few good points worth considering, this video is not a good faith analysis of the bell curve. It is propaganda. From Shaun's political point of view, this book seems to justify the worst kinds of racial stereotypes and to advance regressive and mean-spirited political policies. Therefore, the science must be flawed at best and fraudulent at worst. I have no doubt that Shaun read the bell curve, or at least most of it, but it seems highly unlikely that he read any other sources that support the summary of scientific evidence presented in the book. It seems more likely that he read only sources critical of the book itself, or sources broadly critical of the hereditarian perspective on IQ in general. As a consequence, Shaun makes a number of errors in summarizing the state of the science. Some of these errors are deliberate misrepresentations, while others are probably just misunderstandings due to the biased selection of sources he read while researching his video. There are also a number of points where mitigating evidence is not mentioned, either by omission or because of ignorance. I don't typically claim that someone is making deliberate misrepresentations without qualifying it. Shaun blatantly says at one point that he doesn't argue against what the bell curve says directly, but instead argues against what the authors must believe in order to justify the policy positions they advocate.
This is the main rhetorical trick of the bell curve. They pretend to concede to mainstream scientific opinion, but then propose a set of conservative and eugenicist political policies as if they hadn't. Anyone who genuinely believed all the moderate hedging quotes that Bernstein and Murray put in the bell curve would not be able to propose the policies that they do. We care about their political proposals, not how moderate they pretended to be in order to camouflage their approach to those political proposals. One could, if one wanted, go through my video and find corresponding quotes in the bell curve for pretty much all of my counter-arguments.
He then reiterates this position in an unlisted response video to criticism. As we'll see later in this video, the only way Shaun can claim to debunk the presentation of the science in the book is by erecting a blatant straw man, and this is the excuse he uses to justify it. As a note to the viewer, this video assumes you've already watched Shaun's video in its entirety. Shaun does a decent job at explaining many of the concepts required to discuss the merits of the bell curve, so I won't repeat them here, but when he misrepresents something, I will correct the record. This response is also mostly in chronological order. If you're interested in a particular topic, I've placed timestamps in the description. Finally, before getting started, I want to acknowledge two channels, The Alternative Hypothesis as well as JF Garrity, that have made responses to Shaun's video already. I will make occasional references to these two channels to give them credit when I'm making a point they've already covered, or refer to their responses on an issue that I don't think warrants too much attention, but deserves mention nonetheless. The very first point that needs addressing occurs less than 5 minutes into the video. Shaun is reading a few passages from the bell curve that seem to be very reasonable. Later in the video, Shaun explains why he thinks these passages are perspectives the authors couldn't possibly believe, but even here, while pretending to give the book credit for its moderate tone, Shaun leaves out an important detail that misrepresents the book.
For virtually all the topics we will be discussing, cognitive ability accounts for only small to middling proportions of the variation among people. It almost always explains less than 20% of the variance, to use the statistician's term, usually less than 10% and often less than 5%. What this means in English is that you cannot predict what a given person will do from his IQ score. So what's going on here?
After explaining that you can't predict what a given person will do from his IQ score, he leaves out this important passage. On the other hand, despite the low association at the individual level, large differences in social behavior separate groups of people when the groups differ intellectually on the average. This is a very important point in regards to Shaun's thesis. One of Shaun's claims is that the authors pretend to defer to a more moderate, conservative, mainstream scientific consensus, while their actual privately held conclusions are far more radical, as exposed by their extreme policy proposals. So when the authors admit that IQ explains 20% or less of the variance in socioeconomic outcomes, they are merely covering themselves against accusations that they are IQ absolutists, which is allegedly implied by their policy prescriptions. The sentence that Shaun leaves out makes the important distinction between individual differences and aggregate population differences. Bernstein and Murray drive this point home on pages 19 and 20 of their book. Given two 11-year-old students, one with an IQ of 90 and the other 110, what can you predict based on this information? Not much. But given two 6th grade classes, one with an average IQ of 90 and the other 110, what can be said? At this point, you can make some predictions with a good degree of confidence. This is a basic principle of statistics. A sample size of 2 is almost worthless. As the sample size increases, even relatively weak effects will inevitably manifest in the data. As the bell curve argues, for many socioeconomic outcomes, an IQ score, while still leaving a lot of individual performance unaccounted for, is still the single best piece of information you can have, especially in regard to average population differences. For a more concrete example, consider the correlation of IQ and wages. According to this meta-analysis, the correlation is only about 0.23. Squaring this number means IQ explains only 5% of the variance in wages. Yet consider this data from the bell curve. In 1989, whites earned about $27,000 per year on average, compared to blacks that earned $21,000 per year on average. When matched for IQ, this gap fell from about $6,000 to about $500. IQ tells you very little about what one person is likely to earn, but it can tell you a lot when comparing average IQ for large groups of people. Following this, Shaun gives an outline of his video, then summarizes how there is little theoretical agreement on what intelligence is. At around 11 minutes in, Shaun seems to conflate phrenology, which is a well-established pseudoscience, with craniometry, which pertains to the measurement of skull size and volume.
So way back in the old days, if we wanted to determine someone's personality traits and abilities, we could measure their skull, calculate the volume of their brain, or simply look at their facial features. Phrenology, however, has fallen out of favour with scientists of late, although it should be noted the technology sector is currently in the process of reinventing it. Now, I won't be going all that deeply into the history of intelligence testing today, so I'll just start off here by saying that researchers eventually, for the most part anyway, stopped measuring people's skulls and started trying to measure what was going on inside them.
I don't think this point is worth spending too much time on, since Shaun only mentions it in passing. The alternative hypothesis covers this in detail in a second video response to Shaun, so please refer to that if you're interested. If I had to guess, the alternative hypothesis spent so much time on this topic in order to challenge the extremely popular Stephen Jay Gould narrative in general, that IQ tests are just the latest iteration in a flawed tradition of misusing science for nefarious purposes. Part of this involves correcting the popular misconception that 19th century skull measuring guys like Samuel George Morton were being misled by their own racist assumptions, when in fact they seem to be accurately reporting their data. At around 16 minutes in, Shaun claims that intelligence tests were getting people sent to gas chambers.
Now, not to spoil the end of my video here, but this is a good chunk of the reason that the reaction to the bell curve was so harsh. The idea that we can use intelligence test results in order to inform political policy was only half a lifetime before the book was written, getting people sent to gas chambers. So it's not surprising that people would be rather suspicious about it.
This is also not something worth dwelling on since it has little relevance to Shaun's broader arguments, but it is true that Nazis rejected IQ tests as understood in the United States and most of Western Europe. They regarded these tests as a tool originating from a certain ethnic religious group that they were not too fond of. Again, refer to this video if you're interested. But Shaun's broader point that IQ tests were used for some nefarious purposes early on is certainly true regardless of the Nazi Party's opinion on IQ tests. At around 19 minutes in, Shaun brings up Cyril Burt claiming that he faked his twin study data,
including the case of Cyril Burt, an early proponent of the use of twin studies for examining the heritability of intelligence, who after he died was revealed to have just been making up his research data. That's one way to do it, I suppose.
It's worth mentioning there has been a vigorous debate as to whether Burt really did fake his data, with numerous books and journal articles arguing both sides of this. This was somewhat significant back in the 1970s since there weren't very many studies of twins reared apart back then, but in 1994 when the bell curve was published, this was basically an irrelevant point. Burt's heritability figures of 0.77 closely match the mean of studies of twins reared apart conducted in the decade since, which is about 0.75. So if Burt did fake his data, he got very lucky in terms of his fake matching subsequent estimates. Shaun then summarizes the four main sections that constitute the main text of the bell curve. He does a fairly good job at this, but there's still a few points worth responding to. When summarizing part 2, he includes a quote from this book, Inequality by Design, which in summarizing the bell curve's analysis says, quote, "Crudely, parents' social class represents nurture, and AFQT score represents nature." This is very crude indeed, since the bell curve assumes a heritability of 0.6, leaving 40% of the IQ variation up to environment or nurture, and socioeconomic index can hardly be reduced to nurture either, since a person's IQ score is a better predictor of SES in adulthood than their parental SES is. We'll talk much more about this later in the video. At about 26 minutes in, Shaun briefly covers the Flynn effect.
However, Bernstein and Murray run into a problem here, which is that IQ scores had been going up, not down, in the decades prior to the publication of the bell curve. This is known as the Flynn effect, named for intelligence researcher James R. Flynn, who documented it, and we will talk more about the bell curve's attempt to account for the Flynn effect later on.
One relevant detail he leaves out is that the bell curve doesn't merely cover the Flynn effect. The first time the phrase "the Flynn effect" appeared in print was in the bell curve. They coined the term in honor of James Flynn. Also, an interesting piece of trivia, James Flynn didn't actually discover the Flynn effect. He certainly did the most work in studying it and justifying it, so I believe he deserves the namesake of the phenomenon, but numerous other researchers noticed this effect before Flynn, most notably Richard Lynn, which Shaun spends about 30 minutes of his video trashing. About 29 minutes in, Shaun gives his interpretation of the basic outline of the arguments and claims of the book. He gets this mostly correct. My only problem is with the first item in his list in which he states, quote, General intelligence is to some degree heritable, innate, unable to be significantly changed, and is unevenly distributed both within and across population groups. I would dispute the characterization of innate, which implies a kind of genetic determinism that Herrnstein and Murray do not advocate. I would also add a caveat to the phrase unable to be significantly changed. If I were to rewrite this, I would say, quote, general intelligence is to some degree heritable, has proven to be difficult to be changed significantly by systematic environmental interventions that have been tried thus far, and is unevenly distributed both within and across populations. I have no argument with the 3 remaining items in his list. At around 30 minutes in, Shaun covers the general intelligence factor and factor analysis. Shaun makes roughly 3 arguments to criticize the concept of the G factor, all of which are either wrong or irrelevant. So first, correlation and causation. Shaun is correct that factor analysis is essentially processing correlational data, and of course correlation does not imply causation. But in the narrow sense of whether the G factor is a valid construct, the correlation-causation argument is irrelevant. The G factor is an empirical fact. Tests of mental ability tend to highly correlate with each other. Several psychologists over the last 100 years have tried to make independent, uncorrelated tests of distinct mental abilities. No one has succeeded in doing this. Entire books have been written about the G factor, Arthur Jensen for instance, but in the narrowest sense, the existence of G justifies the use of a single number for representing an IQ score. Shaun also makes the point that people who do well on, say, verbal test items might tend to do better on other verbal test items, and this is information that wouldn't be captured by a general factor. This is true. Charles Spearman, the guy who discovered G, initially thought there were only 2 factors, the general factor and specific factor that would be specific to each test item. However, some psychologists began to challenge this, noting that there may be group factors similar to what Shaun is describing. In fact, some psychologists, such as Louis Leon Thurstone, initially rejected the G factor and hypothesized the existence of uncorrelated primary mental abilities. So who was right, Spearman or Thurstone? Well, they were both right. Intelligence appears to be multifaceted, but also general, and as it turns out, it's much more general than it is multifaceted. The G factor typically accounts for 40 to 50% of the variance in a test battery, and usually accounts for more than all the other factors combined. In the WISC, it accounts for 4 times the amount of all the other factors put together. The most prominent modern factorial representation of intelligence looks like this. There's primary abilities at the bottom, group factors at the second level, and the G factor at the top. This is called a hierarchical G factor. The evidence for this particular structure is based on what is known as confirmatory factor analysis. The basic factor analysis that Shaun describes is known as exploratory factor analysis. Since there are multiple methods for conducting exploratory factor analysis, you can come up with different models to explain the variance. As Stephen Jay Gould describes in The Mismeasure of Man, you can use factor rotation to ensure that a general factor does not arise. With confirmatory factor analysis, you can statistically test which particular model best represents the data. And the bottom line is that while it's possible to perform a factor analysis where the G factor does not arise, models that use the G factor better represent the data in the correlation matrix. Shaun also displays a graphic indicating a different theory of multifaceted intelligence. This one in particular is Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Gardner himself has never attempted to create a battery of tests that actually test his theory, but other psychologists have, and they've determined that 5 of his 8 intelligences are highly correlated with each other, and the difference in ability between people on these tests is best explained by the G factor. The remaining 3 intelligences may be distinct, but it's more likely that current methods for testing for them are inadequate, or they're better represented by a big 5 personality trait. Shaun also makes a bizarre claim that the G factor theory of intelligence is compatible with a 100% environmental understanding of differences in intelligence. He even calls this a, quote, devil's advocate position. The problem is I'm not sure who he's arguing with here. Nobody that I'm aware of claims the existence of the G factor per se implies anything about genetic or environmental causation. Like I said, the existence of G is purely empirical. Performance of tests tend to highly correlate with each other. Nobody is exactly sure why this occurs, it just does. Now there is evidence that performance on more G-loaded subtests are more heritable than less G-loaded subtests, and that the black-white difference in IQ is mostly loaded on G, and many other interesting implications of the G factor that imply a genetic basis for individual differences in intelligence, but that's for a different video. The point here is that no one claims the existence of G itself implies any causal relationship, genetic or otherwise. And one final point before moving on. In researching this video, I actually purchased 2 of the books Shaun references. Inequality by Design, and Intelligence, Genes, and Success. Intelligence, Genes, and Success is actually just a collection of articles from various scientists. As the subtitle says, scientists respond to the bell curve. As far as I can tell, every single article is critical to varying degrees, except one. There's an article by John Carroll. I was surprised to see him there since he wrote essentially the Bible on factorial analysis of IQ tests, Human Cognitive Abilities, a survey of factor analytic studies. Carroll is actually the guy who invented the three-stratum theory of intelligence that I just covered. Anyway, Carroll, using confirmatory factor analysis to justify his claims, ends the chapter with, quote, Bernstein and Murray were justified in presuming there is such a thing as a general factor of cognitive ability on which human beings differ. I just thought it was funny that one of Shaun's own sources affirms the bell curve's basic position on the G-factor. At about 38 minutes in, Shaun breaks into a section about heritability. I'm not sure why he didn't include a timestamp for this section, since heritability is quite important for the bell curve's overall thesis, and its perceived problems and limitations are important for Shaun's counterarguments, which are basically an attempt to muddy the waters such that heritability doesn't imply anything about genetic causation or constrain the malleability of IQ. Shaun makes quite a few assertions here that are misleading, if not outright deceptive. Rather than going in chronological order, I'll address them in level of importance and work my way down. The biggest problem with this section was well covered by the alternative hypothesis, but since this is a very important problem in Shaun's video, I'll cover it in detail here as well. So Shaun does give a quite accurate definition of heritability, and he has a reasonably good grasp on the concept. Heritability is a population statistic that is defined as the variation in a phenotypic trait that is due to variance in genetics. At about 48 minutes into his video, he refers to an article by Ned Block, which refers to an article in the New Republic, which refers to a CNN interview where Charles Murray says some manifestly wrong things in regard to heritability.
These issues are pathetically misunderstood by Charles Murray. In a CNN interview reported in the New Republic, Murray declared, when we say 60% heritability, it's not 60% of the variation, it is 60% of the IQ in any given person. Later, he repeated that for the average person, 60% of the intelligence comes from heredity, and added that this was true of the human species, missing the point that heritability makes no sense for an individual and that heritability statistics are population relative.
Whether Charles Murray was just entirely misinformed on heritability, or if he just completely bungled a live interview when he was put on the spot, is beside the point. While this is a completely justifiable dunking on Murray, the problem here is that the bell curve provides a completely cogent and accurate definition of heritability that Shaun does not even mention. To quote the bell curve, what we want to know is how much of the variation in IQ in a population, the aggregated differences among the individuals, is due to variation in genetic endowments, and how much is due to variation in environment. If all the population variation in IQ is due to variations in environment, then the heritability is 0. If half is due to environmental variation, it is 0.5. If none is due to environmental variations, it is 1. Heritability, in other words, is a ratio that ranges between 0 and 1 and measures the relative contributions of genes to the variation in a trait. This point is quite important and part of why I claim the video deserves the criticism that it is propaganda. Shaun clearly had no intention of attributing a modicum of charity to this book, and had no problem in creating a blatant straw man in regard to the bell curve's understanding of the concept of heritability. The next topic to mention is Lewontin's garden thought experiment.
And to illustrate this, we will paraphrase a thought experiment by geneticist Richard Lewontin. Let's say we take a packet of seeds and plant them in fertilized soil in a controlled laboratory environment, and we ensure that the growing plants have sufficient and equal amounts of water and light. Now, height in plants is a heritable trait, just like in humans, and the plants would thus grow to a range of different heights. Height in this experiment would be very highly heritable, because the fact we're ensuring the plants have an equal environment means that the variance in heights in the group is solely down to genetics. Next, let's say we do that experiment again, only this time we plant the seeds in bad soil and give them less, but equal within the group, amounts of water and light. The thing to understand here is that height in this second experiment would be exactly as heritable as in the previous experiment. The poor environment will produce smaller plants, but since they are all subject to that environment equally, heritability remains high. The problems arise when we start trying to compare these two groups. Let's say the second group of plants has an average height that is 15% shorter than the first group, for instance. The heritability of height tells us nothing about why that is. Heritability was the same across both groups. The difference between the groups was entirely down to environmental factors, and heritability, despite being high, played no part.
All of this is true. The more important consideration is whether or not this has any actual relevance to the question of the black-white IQ gap. For the extent to which mean IQ differences between designated racial groups are due to environmental factors, these environments can be categorized into roughly two categories: variable environments and X factors. Variable environments refers to environments that vary within and between groups. This would be such things as SES, levels of nutrition, school quality, lead, prevalence of breastfeeding, and a number of other variables that have a plausible or empirically demonstrated effect on IQ and vary within racial groups as well as between racial groups. By contrast, Lewontin's garden is an X-factor type environment, something that differentially affects one group versus the other and is uniform across the affected groups. Rather than telling you my opinion on the merit of the X-factor theory, I'll let James Flynn, of Flynn Effect fame, a guy who believes the racial IQ gaps are probably entirely due to environmental differences, explain it for me. In many of these quotes, Flynn is referring to Arthur Jensen, but for all practical purposes you could exchange Jensen with Herrnstein or Murray, since they make many of the same arguments. Far too many of Jensen's critics have not taken up the challenge to refute him in any serious way. Rather, they have elected for various forms of escape, the most popular of which has been to seize upon an argument put forward by the distinguished Harvard geneticist Richard C. Lewontin. I see nothing in Lewontin's example to encourage optimism. We environmentalists have always known that we had to find environmental factors that handicapped blacks. To be told those factors must be uniform within black and white, like a nutrient artificially doled out during a controlled scientific experiment, is not much help. The point is probably lost on no one that Lewontin's garden example is supposed to be analogous to racism against African Americans in the United States. Again, to quote James Flynn. This is simply an escape from hard thinking and hard research. Racism is not some magic force that operates without a chain of causality. Racism harms people because of its effects, and when we list those effects, lack of confidence, low self-image, emasculation of the male, the welfare mother home, poverty, it seems absurd to claim that any of them does not vary significantly within both black and white America. So while it is true as Shaun claims that heritability does not necessarily imply anything about between-group differences, this fact only holds given the existence of these pervasive X factors, which the more honest environmentalists acknowledge are not a very plausible explanation for group differences in average IQ. In the absence of X factors, within-group heritability can help build a circumstantial case that group differences probably have a genetic component. The more heritable a trait is, the greater the environmental differences between the groups would be necessary to produce this difference in strictly environmental terms. Given a heritability estimate, whether it be 0.5 or 0.8, we can then calculate what this difference would need to be in terms of standard deviations, and then compare this with the observed differences in environments between the two groups. Arthur Jensen used what James Flynn called a two-step argument. He first demonstrates the high heritability of IQ within both blacks and whites, and then shows that the environmental differences necessary to explain the gap are much higher than anything that can be quantified in terms of income, nutrition, education, and so on. To quote James Flynn, Jensen does not believe that heritability estimates alone can decide the issue of genetic versus environmental hypotheses. However, he argues that the probability of a genetic hypothesis will be much enhanced if, in addition to evidencing high heritability estimates, we find we can falsify literally every plausible environmental hypothesis one by one. He challenges social scientists who believe in an environmental explanation of the IQ gap between the races to bring their hypothesis forward. Given his competence and the present state of the social sciences, the result is something of a massacre. To summarize, simply showing that an X factor can explain group differences despite high within-group heritability is not a compelling argument. You need to identify candidate variables that uniformly affect one group and not the other. Racism is not a valid candidate without explaining mechanisms that don't already vary within and between the racial groups. Shaun makes the claim at various points in the video that heritability implies nothing in regard to malleability. This is true in principle, but basically false in practice. Nevin Sasardik clarifies this in his book Making Sense of Heritability by contrasting what is known as local modifiability versus modifiability in principle. To quote Sesardic, contrary to what critics of hereditarianism so often say, heritability does place a constraint on malleability if environmental influences are restricted to those already included in the calculation of heritability. For example, if heritability is 60%, then by equalizing existing environments you can eliminate 40% of the total variation. If you aim for more with this method, you are logically confused. Any heritable trait is modifiable in principle by some future unknown environmental influence, but heritability gives you a good measure of how much existing environmental influences in the population right now actually influence IQ on average. While I'm talking about heritability and malleability, Shaun also mentions the difference in height between North Koreans and South Koreans and uses this example to criticize the bell curve's interpretation of heritability.
Or for another example, North Koreans are on average a few inches shorter than South Koreans, and this is down to the different material conditions in those two countries, not some recent radical divergence in genetics. Height is heritable in both North and South Korea, but it's the environment that is the cause of the variance between the groups. This is something that the bell curve crucially misunderstands when talking about the heritability of intelligence and IQ. On page 109 they say, even a heritability of 0.6 leaves room for considerable change if the changes in environment are commensurably large. The implication here being that higher heritabilities would be less affected by changes in the environment, and this is just not how it works.
As just described, this is exactly how it works. Shaun seems to have forgotten his own lesson that heritability doesn't indicate anything about between-group differences, as with the example of North Koreans versus South Koreans. What Herrnstein and Murray said in that passage is perfectly correct. Heritability does indeed constrain malleability, provided that the range of environments is restricted to those already used in the calculation. It has no necessary implication for between-group differences, such as the North and South Korean example. This is an example of a legitimate X factor, in this case where the mean level of nutrition differs uniformly between the two groups. As previously discussed, the presence of an X factor for the black-white IQ difference is not nearly as self-evident as the nutrition difference for the North versus South Korean example. Shaun also mentions the fact that environments are heritable too, quoting this line from the bell curve.
Those differences between people could be caused by environmental factors because, twist, environments are heritable too. As the bell curve itself points out, non-genetic characteristics can nonetheless run in families. For practical purposes, environments are heritable too.
In this section of the book, the authors were making a point that even if the black-white IQ gap were entirely environmental, that would not necessarily imply that the gap is any more malleable than if the gap were genetic. It would give us no clue as to the nature and magnitude of environmental interventions necessary to significantly close this gap. Outside of this specific context of the point the authors were trying to make, it is widely accepted that the environments children are exposed to is in part due to the genes of their parents. Socioeconomic status in adulthood is better predicted by IQ than parental socioeconomic status. This means that the parental SES environment the child is exposed to is in part due to the genotype of their parents. When behavioral geneticists talk about the heritability of the environment, they're usually talking about it in this respect. This doesn't help Shaun's side of the argument, though, because the gene-environment correlation variance is typically attributed to the environment, despite the fact that it is influenced by genetics. Therefore, it underestimates the heritability of IQ rather than exaggerating it. And finally, Shaun mentions a thought experiment that wearing earrings could be heritable. In this case, women would be much more likely to wear earrings than men due to gender roles and fashion, so the genotype of being female would be highly correlated with wearing earrings, despite having no genetic causality. Shaun goes on to draw an analogy between wearing earrings and having darker skin. The genotype of having darker skin would be associated with having lower IQ due to discrimination and lack of educational opportunities rather than direct genetic causation. This is another instance of gene-environment correlation. The earring example is one of many such examples to argue that heritability analysis will produce erroneous results that would attribute genetic causality to something that is clearly environmental in origin. But yet again, as with Lewontin's garden, what relevance does this earring thought experiment have to do with the topic at hand? The presence of gene-environment correlations in twin studies used to estimate the heritability of IQ is an empirical question. Once you get into the details of how heritability is estimated, the irrelevance of such thought experiments quickly becomes apparent. There's two possible ways gene-environment correlations could pose a problem for twin studies, both involving the violation of assumptions. For twins reared apart, heritability is estimated under the assumption that their environments are uncorrelated with respect to trait-relevant environmental variables. A potential violation of this would be that since identical twins have almost identical appearance, society would treat them similarly in a way that could affect their IQ. Another twin study method is twins reared together, where the correlation in IQ of identical twins reared together is compared to the correlation in IQ of fraternal twins reared together. This type of study relies on the equal environments assumption, that the identical twins do not have more similar environments to each other than do fraternal twins for trait-relevant environments. In this case, it could be that identical twins would be treated more similarly by their parents as well as society in some way that affects IQ. Therefore, the genetic influence of IQ would be overestimated. To invalidate these assumptions, you need to show that such gene-environment correlations actually exist and that they can potentially affect IQ. There is a huge volume of literature on this topic for both identifying gene-environment correlations and determining how much these correlations affect heritability estimates. The best summary I've found is from this paper, which concludes that the equal environments assumption isn't entirely valid, but the resulting bias is still relatively modest. One day, somebody may find a hypothesis that invalidates the assumptions used in twin studies, but again, this is an empirical question solved by forming a hypothesis and then testing it. You cannot simply dismiss heritability estimates a priori with thought experiments regarding unrelated phenotypes and hypothetical gene-environment correlations. Behavioral geneticists are well aware that these correlations could exist in principle. To what extent they actually exist and influence a specific phenotype like IQ is a different question. A second problem with Shaun's earring example is that by pivoting to race, Shaun's analogy breaks down because the possible gene-environment correlation related to having dark skin is inscrutable to methods of behavioral genetics currently available. As Shaun has correctly pointed out already, heritability has no necessary implications for between-group differences. You cannot have an identical twin, fraternal twin, or full sibling where one is African American and the other is white, for instance. Having darker skin and therefore being discriminated against by society isn't something that could be erroneously attributed to genes, because through the methods available to estimate heritability in humans, there wouldn't be any variation of, quote, having dark skin in the population. The rest of Shaun's objections are not really objections at all, but seem more to be possible misunderstandings his audience might have, such as the heritability of number of limbs to be 0, despite it obviously being a genetically determined trait. At about 50 minutes in, Shaun covers the methods by which heritability estimates are made, which is primarily with twin studies, kinship studies, and adoption studies. Shaun makes a rather astounding misrepresentation in this section. He rattles off the average correlations in these studies and dismisses them because they do not show that IQ is 100% heritable. For instance, that the IQ of identical twins do not perfectly correlate, that IQ of siblings raised apart are not the same as those raised together, and that adopted children have a non-zero correlation of IQ with their adoptive parents.
Firstly, the IQs of identical twins do not perfectly correlate, as we would expect them to, given their nearly identical genetics. The correlation of siblings who are raised apart is weaker than the correlation of siblings who are raised together, and probably most troublesome for a purely genetic model here is that there is also some correlation between parents and adopted children. Their scores correlate to some degree, despite there being no immediate genetic link, beyond being the same species, of course.
Again, this is a really bizarre take. Nobody says that environment doesn't matter, and this section immediately follows the summary of the bell curves take where they assume a heritability of 60%. This means 40% is left to environment, so of course twins won't perfectly correlate, whether raised separately or together, siblings raised apart will have different environments, and the home environments will rub off to a degree on adopted children. Shaun seems to think the adopted children correlating with the adoptive parents to be the most striking example here, but he leaves out one important detail if he was aware of it at all. Most studies show that this correlation drops to nearly 0 by the time these adopted children reach adulthood. Again, this was a really unexpected take. For all the criticism I have for Shaun, he's by far the most intelligent critic on YouTube I've encountered so far. He's way ahead of Kraut and T, Sondre, Forever James, and David Pakman. Shaun then pivots to talking about molecular genetic evidence, claiming this is what is really required to demonstrate a genetic link to intelligence. Before addressing this claim specifically, let's back up and put this into proper context. Shaun makes the assertion at several points in his video that the bell curve never proves a genetic basis for intelligence. He uses 2 quotes from the bell curve to justify this. The first is from chapter 13, where the authors say, quote, "It seems highly likely to us that both genes and environment have something to do with racial differences. What might the mix be? We are resolutely agnostic on that issue. As far as we can determine, the evidence does not justify an estimate." He also, on at least one occasion, references a quote from chapter 4 where the authors say the following regarding heritability. Quote, "The state of knowledge does not permit a precise estimate." The first thing to note is that Shaun is conflating two separate issues: the contribution of genetics for within-group differences using heritability estimates, and the contribution of genetics for between-group differences. The bell curve acknowledges that the evidence does not provide an estimate as to what degree genes or environment are responsible for between-group differences. This is essentially what that first quote is saying. The evidence for within-group genetic estimates are well supported by twin family and adoption studies. Shaun likes to quote this statement, "The state of knowledge does not permit a precise estimate," in isolation. Let's look at what the entire passage actually says. In fact, IQ is substantially heritable. The state of knowledge does not permit a precise estimate, but half a century of work, now amounting to hundreds of empirical and theoretical studies, permits a broad conclusion that the genetic component of IQ is unlikely to be smaller than 40% or higher than 80%. The most unambiguous direct estimates based on identical twins raised apart produce some of the highest estimates of heritability. For purposes of this discussion, we will adopt a middling estimate of 60% heritability, which by extension means IQ is about 40% a matter of environment. The balance of evidence suggests the 60% may err on the low side. Shaun seems to imply that the sentence, "the state of knowledge does not permit a precise estimate," to be equivalent to saying, "we're not really sure." But with the full context, they claim that it is definitely more than 40% and less than 80%, but the balance of evidence points closer to 80 than to 40. If you really dig into the twin study literature, this is basically what you find as well. By adulthood, the heritability of IQ is generally in the 75% range. This is basically what Wikipedia says as well, by the way. So we know from heritability estimates that genes almost certainly provide a significant contribution to the individual differences in IQ. It is where you get into the between-group differences, such as the black-white gap, where things become far less certain. It's important to note that the bell curve does not make any direct claim on this point. In fact, on page 270 they state, quote, "The debate about whether and how much genes and environment have to do with ethnic differences remains unsolved," unquote. They make it clear that it is only their opinion that genes probably have some contribution of unknown proportion to these differences. Most of the analysis in this book would remain unchanged if the racial gaps were not discussed at all, making this molecular genetic evidence standard for proving the genetic basis for IQ a bit of a red herring. But I do acknowledge that molecular genetic evidence of some kind is the only way the question of between-group IQ differences will be definitively resolved. At about 53 minutes in, Shaun discusses the concept of race. This is an attempt to muddy the waters in regards to the concept of race, therefore casting doubt on the possibility of genetic differences between racial groups affecting average IQ. JF covers this at length in his response, so I won't dwell on it too much here. To be brief, race is more than just skin color. Aboriginals and Africans have equally dark skin, but it's easy enough to distinguish one from the other. Albino Africans exist, no one mistakes them for Europeans. It's not a coincidence that you can generally tell where someone's ancestors live just by looking at their facial features. Although our, quote, "skin color folk understanding of race," unquote, only crudely maps onto an actual genetic framework of human evolutionary history, doesn't make this concept of race an invalid category. If a category allows us to make useful predictions, then it's valid from a purely scientific framework. Just because a category is suboptimal does not make it invalid. And since race can generally be determined with some level of confidence just by looking at someone's facial features and yes, skin color, then race is a useful, if suboptimal, category. So the question is, does race correspond to differences at the level of the genome? Well, yes it does, and the evidence for this is basically incontrovertible at this point. The common refrain of "there's more variation within racial groups than between racial groups" is based on Richard Lewontin's 1972 paper, The Apportionment of Human Diversity. For this analysis, he used the categories of Caucasian, African, Mongoloid, South Asian Aboriginals, Native Americans, Oceanians, and Australian Aboriginals. Although this analysis that about 85% of genetic variation exists within races and about 8% exists between races is basically accurate, his analysis does not take into account correlation of allele frequencies. This is known as Lewontin's fallacy. Certain alleles might only be slightly more common in one race versus the other, But as you take more and more of these alleles in aggregate that have unequal distributions across continental populations, the chance of misclassifying a person based on the above categories approaches zero. This is well supported by what is known as genetic cluster analysis. This began with a paper by Rosenberg in 2002 and has only become more sophisticated since. There's been a variety of arguments used to attempt to discredit the methodology of cluster analysis, but if you want an easy heuristic on whether these arguments are valid, consider the fact that 23andMe and Ancestry.com exist. If what Lewontin was claiming were true, this kind of technology would not be possible, or it wouldn't have nearly the degree of accuracy that we see. At around 57 minutes in, Shaun addresses perceived problems he sees with IQ tests themselves. Shaun mentions information tests, specifically from the Army Alpha, as something he just assumes is biased with no further examination. Information tests like these have been used since the very first IQ test, the Binet-Simon scale. I don't know how much analysis went into the Army Alpha test, but on the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, information tests are extremely well validated. They don't just put in some trivia and just wing it when putting these tests together. They try items like this on hundreds or thousands of subjects, so they know the difficulty of each item in terms of how many people know the right answer, and they know how well the results of information tests correlate with other subtests. As I mentioned earlier, the general factor, or G factor, explains more than 50% of the variance in the whisk, and 4 times as much variance as all the other factors put together. The results of this factor analysis is from Arthur Jensen's book, Bias in Mental Testing. This column here shows the G loadings of each subtest. This is basically the correlation of each subtest with the general factor. As can be seen here, the 2 most highly loaded tests are vocabulary and information. So if somebody does well on vocabulary and information, they're also likely to do well on completely unrelated items like block design or object assembly. Although not mathematically guaranteed, as a general rule, the higher a subtest correlates with the G factor, the more correlated it is on average with all the other subtests. If you know someone's score on the vocabulary and information subtests, you can make fairly reliable predictions as to their score on the remaining subtests, even tests that have nothing to do with verbal ability or knowledge. This is because, on average, people's performance on items where you can work out the answer on the spot, and items where you must have been exposed to and retain certain information, tend to highly correlate. Why is this? There's some good ad hoc theories, such as more intelligent people tend to read more and are more curious about things that would be in an information test, and more intelligent people are better able to figure out the meaning of a new word by context and have the kind of mind that thinks, I wonder what that word means. But the truth is, no one knows for sure, but this is what the data says. A considerable amount of experimentation and validation goes into putting any item in an IQ test. Just because something strikes you as biased does not make it so. And the fact that the Whisk information test loads heavily on G strongly implies that it is not biased in the way that Shaun thinks. If performance on the information test was essentially random, in regards to whether or not you were exposed to certain information, these strong correlations would not exist. Setting aside this information test for the time being, the evidence that modern IQ tests in general are not demonstrably biased against social, economic, ethnic, or racial groups is enormous. However, I would add one caveat the bell curve did not explicitly mention, that this quote applies to native-born English-speaking Americans. This is not to say that IQ tests are necessarily biased against non-English-speaking immigrants, or people in other countries that speak a different language, but the case is pretty airtight in regards to people born and raised in the US with English as their first language. This evidence can be briefly summarized as follows. First, however you cut it, races, classes, etc., IQ tests have extremely similar predictive validity between groups for the various things IQ is known to predict. Second, the rank order difficulty of questions is extremely similar between groups. When you look at what items are answered correctly or incorrectly, the progression of difficulty in test items is approximately the same for all groups. If a particular test item were easier for a white kid versus a black kid, or a rich kid versus a poor kid, this would not happen. And third, when test items are ranked by experts in terms of how culturally loaded they are, it is found that less culturally loaded tests actually yield larger gaps between designated racial groups. This last point is interesting because the evidence for it is so great, yet at the same time runs so counter to people's intuition that they just assume cultural bias as a significant contributor to the IQ gaps between groups. To someone unfamiliar with this field, it seems self-evident. As the bell curve says on page 282, the black-white difference is wider on items that appear to be culturally neutral than on items that appear to be culturally loaded. We italicize this point because it is both so well established empirically, yet comes as such a surprise to most people who are new to the topic. Shaun makes a similar complaint about the Armed Forces Qualification Test and its inclusion of trigonometry questions. He argues that trigonometry questions are biased and unfair because it will depend on if someone was taught trigonometry, how recently they were taught it, and how well they were taught it. As with the information test, the correlations with other test types suggest this is not the case. The trigonometry questions would have been on the mathematics knowledge subtest. This subtest correlates at 0.82 with the G factor and has an average correlation with all 10 subtests of the ASVAB, or Armed Forces Vocational Aptitude Battery, at about 0.62. By the way, the AFQT is simply 4 subtests of the ASVAB that have very similar properties to IQ subtests. I tried looking for an example of trigonometry test items that would have been included in the mathematics knowledge subtest. I found some practice tests for the current version of the AFQT, and based on those practice tests, I do not believe the modern AFQT includes any trigonometry questions. But based on some forums and slightly older practice tests, I would bet money that the only trigonometry questions would have been the definitions of sine, cosine, and tangent. So if you were exposed to any trigonometry at all, and had any kind of conceptual understanding of the most basic constructs, these questions would have been easy. Feel free to correct me, and if I'm wrong, I'll be the first to acknowledge this, but I don't think I am. Regardless, this would have been about 3 questions out of 15 or 20 on one of the 4 subtests, having relatively little impact on your overall AFQT score. The idea that differential performance on something like trigonometry being dependent on how well you were taught it is probably wrong as well. Like I just covered, the fact that test items such as vocabulary or information, which one would assume a priori to be influenced by school quality, are such strong predictors of performance on things completely unrelated to schooling, such as object assembly or reverse digit span, suggests that the quality of teaching is probably not very important. If school quality affects trigonometry item test performance, it's probably limited to whether or not you were exposed to trigonometry at all in high school. Before moving on, I should note that the alternative hypothesis actually looked into the data in regard to racial differences in the mathematics knowledge subtest, finding that the racial gaps on the subtest were actually the smallest of not only the 4 subtests of the AFQT, but in fact all 10 subtests of the ASVAB. Shaun responds to this in his unlisted response video that the alternative hypothesis made a huge unforced error in this, because Shaun's argument was that the test was biased for quality of school instruction and had nothing to do with race. This defense is rather ridiculous. One of the most commonly claimed detrimental environments that harms black academic performance in the United States is underfunded and generally poor quality schools. In addition, we all know that if the bell curve chose not to mention race and restricted their analysis to non-Hispanic whites, Shaun would not be making a video about it 25 years later. The hostile reaction this book and the authors received was only because of the race aspect. The racial gaps, and even more so the black-white gap, frames the entire academic debate on test bias. If there were no significant racial gaps, nobody would be talking about test bias. To pretend otherwise is disingenuous. At about 61 minutes in, Shaun discusses the Flynn effect and dysgenics, noting that according to the Flynn effect, people are getting smarter over time due to environmental effects, while possibly becoming less intelligent due to genetic effects, and that it's difficult to disentangle these variables. He mentions that the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth is of little use here because the respondents are young, and that smarter women tend to have children later in life, so this would skew the distribution. Well, there were other NLSY cohorts before the 1979 cohort, and many other sources of data. I'm not really invested in defending the bell curve's dysgenic hypothesis, so I'll leave it at that. Shaun then tries to get cute with an example IQ test item that's entirely in Japanese. It seems he includes this ridiculous hypothetical just to lay the groundwork for his 30-minute Richard Lynn section, in which Lynn does use some IQ test data from studies that had very questionable validity for the verbal test items. Now, it is true that IQ tests have been demonstrated to be biased against people when the test is not in their first language. For instance, Mexican children that learn Spanish as their first language then take the test in English. But for the most part, IQ tests worldwide are administered in the native language of the test taker, or use a non-verbal test such as Raven's progressive matrices. Shaun then characterizes Herrnstein and Murray's analysis of test bias as follows.
When Herrnstein and Murray say properly administered IQ tests are not demonstrably biased, they seemingly mean that the tests themselves do not contain words like regatta, not that the tests necessarily deliver fair results.
Herrnstein and Murray make no such naive assumption. They reference work such as Arthur Jensen's Bias and Mental Testing that comprehensively analyzed everything regarding test bias. Here Shaun proposes the idea that even if the tests aren't biased themselves, minorities could be handicapped by living in a discriminatory, white supremacist state. I don't think Shaun is aware of one of the ways in which IQ tests are not demonstrably biased, is that they have equal predictive validity between ethnic groups, at least in the United States where this has been extensively studied. Of course, it's always possible that the background effect of racism somehow handicaps one group on IQ test performance to the exact same degree that it handicaps socioeconomic outcomes. Note that this would be an unfalsifiable hypothesis. There would be no way to prove this or prove it wrong either. Shaun spends about 30 minutes of his video trashing Richard Lynn specifically on his 1991 paper that the bell curve references to support the conclusion that African IQ is even lower than African American IQ, which the bell curve reads as supporting the notion that the history of slavery, Jim Crow, and so on aren't likely to be a sufficient explanation for lower African American IQ. I actually agree with Shaun to a degree here. I think the data was too preliminary back in 1994 to make a case for average sub-Saharan IQ, and there were plenty of problems with Lynn's data at the time. However, I'm not sure that what Shaun is claiming is accurate, and that these flaws in Lynn's data were already identified prior to 1994. I think most of the significant criticism came after the bell curve was published. But this discussion is pointless here in 2020. The data has been collected, and the range of results for an average IQ in sub-Saharan Africa range between 71, according to Richard Lynn, and about 80 according to his most significant critics. In 2009, Jelt Wichards and his colleagues wrote a paper critical of Richard Lynn's estimates. They criticized him on a number of grounds, mostly that his review of the literature and inclusion criteria was unsystematic. Using all the available data, they did something that most critics of Lynn do not. They came up with their own estimate of sub-Saharan African IQ. Their conclusion was about 80, 78 according to UK norms, and 80 according to US norms. One interesting detail worth mentioning is that Richard Lynn gives his own opinion on what the genotypic IQ of the average sub-Saharan African is. In his 2015 second edition of Race Differences in Intelligence, he estimates it to be about 80. So if the average sub-Saharan African was born into a first world country, they would develop an IQ of 80. In other words, the environment of living in sub-Saharan Africa lowers it from 80 to 71. So how much do Richard Lynn and his most significant critics really disagree here? Perhaps you could criticize the bell curve for citing Lynn's data on this question back in 1994. However, unless I'm missing something, most of this criticism of Lynn came after the bell curve was published. And in the end, the figure of 75 cited in the bell curve wasn't that far off from even the most optimistic estimates. If I were Charles Murray, I would also be hesitant to admit any fault in citing Lynn's data in 1994, since all subsequent data has more or less vindicated the early and admittedly flawed or misinterpreted studies that Lynn used. Whatever the real number is, there's one aspect of this that Shaun is not considering. If your hypothesis of racial IQ gaps is based on purely environmental factors, you should be hoping that Lynn's data is correct. The IQ of 80 as estimated by Wichards and his colleagues uses plenty of data that is outside of South Africa or any other country where it could be argued that blacks were treated as subjects of their colonial oppressors. The variety of countries surveyed and all current data cannot support that hypothesis, so what are we left with? If the environment in Africa is worth only 5 points between Africans and African Americans, what chance do you have in explaining the 15-point gap between African Americans and European Americans in the United States today? As the alternative hypothesis correctly pointed out, the gap between blacks and whites in the US is trivial compared to the environmental differences between Africans and African Americans. Just based on income alone, according to this data from 2016, Africans lived on about $4 per day on average, not to mention differences in education quality, nutrition, healthcare, and so on. Shaun has a kind of intermission during his 30-minute attack on Richard Lynn in which he talks about how IQ tests fall on a normal distribution, usually, and how the AFQT has a skewed distribution that the authors have to correct for. First, Shaun makes the assertion that IQ falling on a normal distribution is an erroneous assumption. If I hadn't just done a bunch of research on IQ test construction for my last video, I would not have known that early IQ tests did fall on approximately normal distributions despite no attempt to do so. The Binet-Simon, the 1916 and 1937 Stanford Binet, and the 1939 Wechsler-Bellevue fell on approximately normal distributions, again, without any design consideration to do so. As Arthur Jensen pointed out, as long as there's a variety of test items, a large variety of difficulties, no gaps in difficulties, and each item in the test measures whatever the test as a whole measures, the distribution and test scores will follow a roughly normal distribution. In Jensen's list of criteria for returning a normal distribution, the AFQT probably failed at the large variety of difficulties and gaps in difficulties at the upper end of the scale. Even so, getting a perfect score was really rare. Only 22 people out of almost 12,000 in the NLSY got a perfect AFQT score. Shaun seems to think the only reason Herrnstein and Murray corrected for skew is because they assume intelligence falls on a normal distribution. But no, the reason they did this was because regression analysis assumes the variables are normally distributed and produces potentially erroneous results if they are not. Near the end of his video in the summary, Shaun strongly implies that Herrnstein and Murray are doing something fishy by correcting for skew. Rather than appeal to any statistical arguments, let's take a look at what effect this correction had on their analysis. For the aspect of this that we all know Shaun is mainly concerned about, the racial gaps, the correction for skew actually reduced the gaps. This table shows the gaps for two different scoring schemes for the AFQT, each in their original distribution as well as corrected for skew. The reason there's two different scoring schemes is because the military decided to switch up one subtest from the ASVAB to include in the AFQT, as well as adjust scoring methods back in 1989. Early drafts of the bell curve were already underway when they found out about the scoring change. They decided the new scoring method was psychometrically superior, so they switched and redid all of their analysis. In terms of the skew affecting relationships between AFQT and socioeconomic outcomes, the authors state, quote, "For most analysis, the answer is the results are unaffected, but it may also be said that whenever differences were found, the scoring procedure we used tended to produce smaller relationships between IQ and the indicators, and smaller ethnic differences than the alternatives. In no instance did the 1989 version corrected for skew yield significant findings that were not also found when using the 1980 uncorrected version. In terms of the relationships explored in this book, the 1989 version corrected for skew is the most conservative of the alternatives." And while the authors provide no evidence for this directly, in my opinion, considering how carefully this book has been scrutinized by its critics, if this were not the case, I'm sure we would have heard about it by now. One of the four main sections of the bell curve concerns the author's own analysis of the NLSY data. They use the non-Hispanic white sample to sidestep the racial aspect, at least for the moment, and use AFQT test scores, parental socioeconomic status, age, and sometimes other factors as independent variables to predict a variety of life outcomes. Although these models typically account for 20% or less of the variance in these outcomes, which the authors explicitly state, it is found that AFQT has more predictive importance when SES is controlled for than vice versa. Shaun tries to tear down the credibility of the regression analysis from Part 2 by referencing this book, Inequality by Design. Chapter 4 of this book attempts to recreate the regression analysis from the bell curve, then by adding other variables captured in the NLSY database, show that all of these composite variables have more explanatory power in terms of the probability of ending up in poverty than IQ does, as measured by AFQT score. They do this by first replacing SES with numerous variables that together constitute a, quote, home index. Then they add still more variables that model the effect of the social environment. Then by adding education to the mix, they succeed in reversing the significance of AFQT versus this broader index of the environment. There's numerous problems with this analysis. First is that it's a straw man of the bell curve on multiple levels. Herrnstein and Murray never claim that IQ is responsible for a majority of the variance in the various life outcomes. In fact, they say it rarely accounts for more than 20% of the variance, and often much less. They merely claim that it is a greater predictor of life outcomes than the very commonly used index of socioeconomic status, which is a combination of the parent's level of education, occupation, and income. Shaun, like many critics of the bell curve, imply that Herrnstein and Murray's measure of SES is somehow a departure from academic norms, and they only include this very narrow measure of SES to inflate the importance of their AFQT score. Murray addresses this criticism in the afterword to the paperback edition. We knew before publishing the bell curve what critics who bother to retrace our tracks will discover. There is no way to construct a measure of socioeconomic background using the accepted constituent variables that make much difference in the independent role of IQ. In the jargon, our measure of SES is robust and as valid as everyone else's has been. Also, quote, until the bell curve came along, measures of SES similar to ours were used without a second thought. Now, suddenly, they are to be questioned. And by the way, the measure of parental SES used in the bell curve is the exact same definition as defined in Wikipedia. As always, of course, Wikipedia isn't an authoritative source, but if you find yourself arguing with Wikipedia, you might want to consider the possibility that you're on the wrong side of an argument. Another straw man is they pick one of the weaker models, the probability of ending up in poverty, as the only model they attack in the main text. It explains far less variance measured by pseudo-R² than many of the other models. It explains about 10% of the variance as to whether someone will end up in poverty. Contrast that with this model, which shows the probability of dropping out of high school, which explains 34%, or getting a college degree that explains 37%. If you really want to debunk the bell curve's logistic regression analysis, these would be more of a hard target. So not only did they single out a weak model, but they described this as, quote, the bell curve's key finding, which is absolutely ridiculous. Part 2 of the bell curve, which spans 150 pages, examines the effect of AFQT and parental SES for predicting poverty, schooling, unemployment, welfare usage, crime, among many other things. This plot is one of 4 plots presented in the poverty section, covering just 16 pages out of 150. The poverty plot is the first one presented in the book, and it is used as an example for a layman's understanding of logistic regression, so I can see how it would draw attention for debunking purposes, but to describe it as, quote, the bell curve's key finding is simply dishonest. The second problem is that much of their analysis is very suspect. The first red flag here is they weren't even able to replicate the bell curve's logistic regression model using the same data. In a footnote, they explain that, quote, it is not a perfect copy here because the bell curve left out a few pieces of technical information we needed to follow its procedure exactly, but it's effectively the same result. I found this weird because this blog, where I originally found a link to download the NLSY data directly, reproduced the regression coefficients in the bell curve out to 4 decimal places. The author of this blog does make it sound like she stumbled across the fact that only the cross-sectional sample of non-Hispanic whites reproduced the bell curve's regression coefficients, but I would chalk this up to her not reading the book closely enough. They state this explicitly in the first paragraph of Appendix 4. I have much more to say about this blog in my next video. Anyway, not only were they unable to reproduce the results of the bell curve, if you actually plot their model that purports to approximately reproduce the bell curve's model, they're not just slightly off, they're way off. And furthermore, if you try to match any of the plots from the main text, they don't match the plots generated from the coefficients in the appendix. I couldn't help wondering on multiple occasions, is this book just filled with errors, or am I losing my mind? Am I getting my math wrong somehow generating these plots? I don't think I am, because I can also generate the bell curve's plots just fine. And finally, this method of analysis is just an abuse of regression analysis in general. The authors of this book keep adding in extra variables into the regression, which in most cases are probably correlated with existing variables already present in the model. In statistics, this is known as multi-collinearity. Each of these additional variables is treated as an independent effect, when in fact it could be highly influenced by intelligence or parental SES. A good example of this is something such as number of books in the house. It wouldn't be surprising to find that the number of books in the house will have some positive correlation with a child's IQ score. But is this because of the number of books per se, or because more intelligent parents will tend to have more books anyway, and also, in part, pass on this intelligence to their child directly? So a variable such as this will artificially reduce the independent effect of IQ in the regression analysis because the variable itself is correlated with parental IQ rather than an independent environmental effect, and also correlated with the IQ of the child that is inherited to some degree from the parents. Failing to account for this possibility is something Arthur Jensen called the sociologist's fallacy. It is just assumed that the number of books influence the child's IQ directly with no consideration to the confounding effects of IQ heritability. How perfectly fitting that every single one of these 6 authors were from the sociology department at UC Berkeley. Shaun actually alludes to this criticism by first insinuating that the bell curve doesn't include more variables just because it would be too complicated.
In a section titled, "But what about other explanations?" they write, "We can already hear critics saying, if only they'd added this other variable to the analysis, they would have seen that intelligence has nothing to do with X. At this point, however, statistical analysis can become a bottomless pit. It is not uncommon in technical journals to read articles built around the estimated effects of a dozen or more independent variables. Sometimes the entire set of variables is loaded into a single regression equation. Sometimes sets of equations are used, modeling even more complex relationships in which all the variables can exert mutual effects on one another. Why should we not press forward? Why not also ask if religious background has an effect on the decision to go on welfare, for example? It's an interesting question, as are 50 others that might come to mind." This is the first of 2 defenses by Bernstein and Murray where they argue that it would just be too complicated to consider all the factors. Why there could be 50 environmental variables affecting someone's likelihood of being in poverty, that's just too many. It would be too complex. Our graph wouldn't make any sense if we did that. So instead of 50, we're just going to consider, 2.
But he then provides some quotes that provide part of the context an explanation as to why the bell curve used a simple SES score for most of their models.
Our principle was to explore additional dynamics when there was another factor that was not only conceivably important, but for clear logical reasons might be important because of dynamics having little or nothing to do with IQ. This last proviso is crucial, for one of the most common misuses of regression analysis is to introduce an additional variable that in reality is mostly another expression of variables that are already in the equation.
It seems like Shaun couldn't pass up making this criticism that the authors were objecting to including more variables just because it would be too hard or too complicated, when he knew that was a straw man, as evidenced by further context he provides just 30 seconds later. So a skeptical viewer might be asking, so maybe those other variables are confounded with IQ, but by how much, and how much does it really matter? None of my arguments have put any hard data to this question. The best analysis on this comes from a paper that the book Inequality by Design actually references. In 1995, Christopher Winship and Sanders Korenman released a paper entitled A Reanalysis of the Bell Curve. The paper is divided into 3 separate sections. The second section is quite similar to what the book Inequality by Design did, but they did the analysis for all of their models rather than just poverty. Even after adding all the additional variables, AFQT was still more important than this composite environmental effect for the dependent variables, except in a few cases. The most interesting result, in my opinion, was their quote, Sibling fixed effects analysis. They came up with an experimental design that Charles Murray says he wished he'd thought of himself. There were a number of siblings in the NLSY data. By using siblings, you can effectively control for everything in the environment shared by siblings. In theory, almost every variable that is included in the Inequality by Design analysis would be captured by this kind of control. The few that weren't, such as the years of education pre and post the AFQT test, can be strongly argued to be a proxy for, or at least highly confounded with intelligence itself. But what is an even more important aspect of this control is that it avoids all the confounding effects of throwing in a dozen or more extra variables that are all each confounded with AFQT or SES to some degree. So let's take a look at what they found. Here's a plot of AFQT score versus the probability of dropping out of high school using the bell curve's SES composite variable. And here's the result of using the sibling fixed effects analysis. The chance of getting a bachelor's degree actually increases using the sibling fixed effects model. There were a few models, such as the chance of ending up in poverty, where the authors noted significant differences, but by plotting the coefficients, how different are they really? The authors were obviously surprised by these results. Quote, the fixed effects estimator is a powerful method for controlling for family background in that it captures all components that are common to siblings. It is surprising that for many of the outcomes, the fixed effects estimates for AFQT are similar to standard estimates. And also, quote, incredible as it may seem, our sibling analysis suggests that, even though Herrnstein and Murray's parental SES index is poorly measured, it appears to be adequate for producing unbiased estimates of the effects of AFQT score on socioeconomic outcomes. This analysis is a powerful indication that the methods of adding everything but the kitchen sink, essentially, are artificially reducing the effect of AFQT due to all the confounds of these variables with intelligence. Towards the end of the section, Shaun accuses the bell curve of circular logic when they point out that controlling for SES between racial groups is problematic, since SES is in itself partly caused by cognitive ability. The part Shaun seems to be missing, either accidentally or deliberately, is that the bell curve does not claim that cognitive ability completely determines SES. In the NLSY data, it is correlated at about 0.5, so squaring that means that it determines about 25% of the variance in SES. Likewise, they point out that parental SES influences child IQ. We know both of these things are probably true in terms of causality. A child's IQ is a better predictor of SES later in life than parental SES is, and we know that from adoption studies that being adopted into a higher SES home increases IQ compared to controls that were not adopted. Variables can have a bidirectional causal effect. There is no inherent contradiction or paradox here. Shaun claims the authors resolve this supposed paradox by just declaring that cognitive ability comes first.
The bell curve solves the conundrum of whether cognitive ability or environment should come first by saying, cognitive ability. That's first. We like that one the most, so that's the one that comes first.
I honestly have no idea what he's trying to say here. I suspect that Shaun doesn't understand what logistic regression analysis is actually doing. For example, consider this plot. This shows the probability of getting a bachelor's degree. This line shows the percentage chance someone has based on their AFQT score while holding SES constant, and this line shows the effect of SES while holding AFQT constant. This analysis does not depend on any causal designation one way or the other. The regression treats these as independent variables, and the only reason the bell curve would say that AFQT score is more important here is that it has a much larger effect on the outcome in terms of probability of the dependent variable than SES does. About 2 hours into Shaun's video, he brings up Philippe Rushton, because of course no bell curve debunking video would be complete without mentioning Rushton and reducing his entire career into penis versus brain size. It would be only a slight exaggeration to say that I could have written this response on Shaun's coverage of Rushton without even watching it. Needless to say, it's a ridiculous straw man to characterize Rushton's work as simply an inverse relation of genital size and brain size. Whatever the validity of Rushton's work in general, he claims something like 70 variables that fell on an East Asian to European to African continuum, such as twinning rates, age of puberty, pregnancy length. The bell curve spent less than 2 pages on Rushton tucked in the back of Appendix 5, which is itself about 20 pages long. The strongest defense they made of him was that he was not a crackpot. I don't have much interest in defending Rushton, and I know he's an understandably juicy target that critics can't resist, but to say that he is a peripheral issue to this book is beyond an understatement. Immediately following the section on Rushton, Shaun makes a rather bold claim that if Herrnstein and Murray had simply published a list of IQ scores by country, this hypothetical book would not be seen as controversial.
You see, for all Herrnstein and Murray's posturing about how brave they're being, speaking out and breaking taboos and all that, it is not actually controversial in the scientific community to simply acknowledge group differences in IQ. Let's imagine that instead of the bell curve, Herrnstein and Murray had simply published a list of IQ test results showing differences in IQ in different countries. Nobody would have cared.
This is ridiculous. There's only one way to discuss IQ in public without getting cancelled into oblivion: by immediately declaring that all these differences are definitely the result of environmental influences, including racially motivated oppression of some sort, or the legacy of past oppression at the very least. The reason Herrnstein and Murray had to cover race in this book is because this book is about the United States as of about 1990 when this book was being written. At the time, the US was about 12% African American and about 6.5% Latino/Hispanic. Overall, the country was about 83% non-Hispanic white. Since there are large IQ disparities between these groups, whatever the cause, you can't really ignore this when talking about, quote, intelligence and class structure in American life. If this book had been written today, it would be even more relevant considering non-Hispanic whites are now about 63% of the population. Most of the rest of Shaun's video is guilt by association stuff regarding Mankind Quarterly, the Pioneer Fund, and eugenics. I'm not going to comment on any of that, but I do have a few comments on Shaun's analysis of their policy proposal section. So first, Shaun brings up Head Start and characterizes the bell curve's position on this as follows.
Herrnstein and Murray acknowledge that these programs can have temporary positive effects, but they argue that these positive effects fade over time and become statistically insignificant by the time those children leave school. This is taken by Herrnstein and Murray as proof that there is ultimately nothing to be done to help these kids. Any temporary positive effects will simply fade away due to their inferior genetics, so we should stop wasting money on them and instead give it to the naturally gifted children.
This is a ridiculously uncharitable reading of Herrnstein and Murray. First, their arguments about malleability of IQ do not rest solely on its heritability. For instance, to quote the bell curve, if the differences are genetic, aren't they harder to change than if they are environmental? Another common reaction, this one relies on a false assumption about intelligence. The underlying error is to assume that an environmentally caused deficit is somehow less hardwired, that it has less impact on, quote, real capabilities than does a genetically caused deficit. We have made this point before, but it bears repeating. Some kinds of environmentally induced conditions can be changed, but there is no reason to think that intelligence is one of them. And even though they are skeptical of the ability of programs like Head Start to raise cognitive ability in the long term, they don't actually advocate ending these programs. To quote the bell curve, there's no reason to think that any realistically improved version of Head Start, with its thousands of centers and millions of participants, can add much to cognitive functioning. Even the claims for long-term benefits of Head Start on social behavior are unsubstantiated. Such findings do not invalidate Head Start's value as a few hours daily refuge for small children that need it. But the debate over Head Start should move away from frivolous claims about how many dollars it will save in the long term, none of which stand up to examination, and focus instead on the degree to which it is actually serving the laudable and more fundamental function of rescuing small children from unsuitable, joyless, and dangerous environments. The next topic Shaun addresses is low IQ mothers and the bell curve's suggestion to eliminate welfare programs that essentially reward women financially for having children. I actually agree with Shaun on this. Really low IQ people are probably not going to respond to incentive changes like this and would likely not make them less likely to have children. I'm not sure what the right answer is to this, but cutting welfare programs that adjust for having dependent children would be ineffective as well as cruel, unless it led to a massive shift in the culture of the underclass that would react to this change in incentives. The next topic Shaun covers is the bell curve's analysis and recommendations regarding affirmative action, which he claims are in direct contradiction with the author's concerns about cognitive stratification and the growing cognitive elite. In order to accomplish this, Shaun has to strawman the book's policy recommendations. Shaun seems to think the book calls for simply ending race-based affirmative action and for universities admitting students entirely by test scores. So let's compare this to what the book actually says. To quote the bell curve, "It is time to return to the original intentions of affirmative action, to cast a wider net, to give preference to members of disadvantaged groups, whatever their skin color, when qualifications are similar." In the next passage, Shaun does quote the first part, but leaves out the second. The full context is, quote, "In the case of two candidates that are closely matched otherwise, universities should give the nod to the applicant from the disadvantaged background." And for the part that Shaun leaves out, quote, "What does closely matched means in terms of test scores? We have no firm rules, but as a guideline, admissions officers might aim for an admissions policy such that no identifiable group, such as a racial minority, has a mean that is more than half a standard deviation below the rest of the student body." That last part is rather interesting. The authors are actually in favor of race-based affirmative action as long as the gap in test scores are no larger than something like half a standard deviation. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Shaun, at several points in this section, characterizes the bell curve as favoring legacy-based admissions. I cannot find any passage that supports this. As far as I can tell, they only speak of legacy admissions in passing, noting how it was more common in the past, yet still conferred some benefit as elite schools increasingly placed emphasis on test scores. Shaun then makes a bizarre argument that seems to deny that minority students actually get a quote ethnic premium in regard to test scores. His argument seems to boil down to the fact that minority students score poorly on the SAT, so whatever entrance criteria the school decides to use, you would expect this to be the case. And this would still be the case if test scores were the sole criteria for admissions. There would still be minority students at these elite universities, and because they score lower, you would expect to find that in the data in this case as well. There's two major problems with this argument. First is we know that universities place a large emphasis on test scores for admissions. Let's take Harvard, for instance. For a white student, you need to score something like the top 2% of the SAT, 2 standard deviations above the mean and up, to have any serious chance of getting in. For comparison, 2 standard deviations above the mean in IQ would be 130 and up. The fact is, elite schools only take elite students, and having a high SAT or ACT is mandatory, at least for white and Asian applicants. Also, Shaun does not convey the massive gap in SAT scores between admitted white and black students at these elite universities. The bell curve took a look at the top 26 colleges and universities and the racial disparity in test scores. On average, the black mean was 1.3 standard deviations, or 180 points below the white mean. Another way to put this in perspective, there is approximately 1 standard deviation in IQ separating the average high school graduate from the average college graduate. Converted to IQ, 1.3 standard deviations would be an IQ gap of nearly 20 points. The SAT was actually a decent proxy for IQ when the bell curve was written, prior to changes made in 1994, which reduced its correlation with IQ. Another way to put it, a gap of 1.3 standard deviations places the average black student at the 10th percentile of students by white norms. Near the end of his video, Shaun mentions Linda Gottfredson and her Mainstream Science on Intelligence op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and how she and many of the signatories were funded by the Pioneer Fund. This is all true, but this is far from the only collection of experts that have defended the science presented in the bell curve. This task force report, Intelligence Knowns and Unknowns, was put together by the American Psychological Association, and its findings support many of the key assertions put forth in the bell curve regarding intelligence, G, heritability of IQ, and so on. This paper by Snyderman and Rothman, published in 1987, surveyed experts on a whole range of issues that were covered in the bell curve and largely came to the same conclusions. Check out this video for a more in-depth analysis of each of these 3 sources. And finally, Shaun then provides a summary of his arguments against the bell curve, therefore providing me with at least a starting point to summarize what he gets wrong in the video.
But let's first briefly summarize our main counter-arguments to the bell curve. Firstly, the bell curve does not prove that genetics are the primary reason for differences in intelligence. The authors are not geneticists, they're a psychologist and a social scientist.
The bell curve accurately presents the state of knowledge on the heritability of IQ based on twin, kinship, and adoption studies. The contribution of genetics to individual differences within both black and white American populations are well supported by these studies. The authors acknowledge that the degree to which genes are responsible for between-group differences in IQ cannot be established by these methods. Estimates of heritability are based on the field of behavioral genetics, which is within the field of psychology. Richard Herrnstein was well versed in the statistical techniques and methodology of behavioral genetics.
After failing to make the case that IQ is genetic in origin, they compare that IQ not to one's social background as the back cover of the book promises, but a much more narrowly defined index of parental socioeconomic status, which includes only a few of the relevant variables.
The SES index was rarely accused of being a poor measure of social background until the bell curve came along. As I've demonstrated, adding in these extra variables as done in the inequality by design analysis attenuates the effect of IQ far more than the Sibling fixed effects analysis does, which is about the most comprehensive control for social and family background available. This is strong evidence that all these additional variables packed into their model are highly confounded with parental IQ.
The main source of their data is more a test of academic achievement than intelligence, and since it did not return a normal bell curve distribution, Herrnstein and Murray manipulated the data to exaggerate what were previously much smaller differences.
As well evidenced in Appendix 3 of the bell curve, AFQT is a highly G-loaded test, so it measures well what IQ tests are typically designed to measure. If Shaun had read Appendix 3, he would have also found these two charts, which show that AFQT highly correlates with a number of IQ tests to a higher degree than some of the most common tests such as the WAIS, WISC, and Stanford-Binet correlate with each other. And while correcting for skew does exaggerate the differences between subjects at the high end of the scale, Herrnstein and Murray demonstrate also in Appendix 3 that the corrected for skew distribution actually reduced the racial gaps in scores, and claim that no result from Part 2 changed to any significant degree whether or not the distribution was corrected for skew.
Having now read a lot of criticism of the bell curve, I think I've identified a particular difficulty that people have in arguing against it. And it's a tendency to argue with not the opinions that Herrnstein and Murray claim to hold, but the opinions that they would have to hold in order to support the policy proposals which they do. For example, it makes no sense to claim that IQ explains only a tiny amount of the variance between people, and that you cannot know what someone will do from their IQ, as Herrnstein and Murray do, and then move on to claim that IQ is one of the best ways of determining an employee's individual productivity, and employers should pick applicants with the highest IQs.
This section exposes both the flaws and dishonesty of Shaun's video better than any other section. Paradoxically, though, he's basically admitting that he's strawmanning the book, so he's being honest about his dishonesty in a sense. What he's essentially doing is justifying a bad faith critique of the book. Since the bell curve doesn't make its case in good faith, in Shaun's view, why should he extend the same charity? Even if you think this is a justifiable position to take, it assumes he understands what the book actually says, and that he's not leaving out some important context that, if provided, makes their policy recommendations more congruent with the presentation of the science. For example, notice in this first quote here, it ends with, quote, "a point we have made in part 1. What does the rest of this paragraph say? The full passage is as follows. What this means in English is that you cannot predict what a given person will do from his IQ score, a point that we have made in part 1 and will make again for it needs repeating. On the other hand, despite the low association at the individual level, large differences in social behavior separate groups of people when the groups differ intellectually on the average. I covered this near the beginning of the video, but I cannot emphasize enough how important this context is. Once you understand this, the importance of mean differences in IQ between groups of people in society has dramatic implications, which is mainly what this book is about. And I have trouble believing that Shaun did not read that sentence and understand its importance. This applies to many other things in his video. Although heritability estimates provide powerful evidence that IQ among individuals within ethnic groups is highly mediated by genetics, and helps build a circumstantial case that IQ between ethnic groups might be as well, Their policy proposals do not rest on this. Whether IQ is highly heritable or not, it appears to be quite stable starting at age 6 and quite resistant to environmental interventions that have been tried in the modern United States specifically, where many environmental variables known to influence IQ are relatively uniform in the population, meaning everyone basically gets enough to eat and has access to schooling up through high school. To the degree to which environments aren't evenly distributed, well, nobody claims IQ is 100% heritable either. The bell curve leaves 40% of the variance up to environment. They also make the point that it's a faulty assumption to conclude that genetic implies immutable and that environmental implies malleable. If we knew IQ differences were all up to environmental variation, it wouldn't give us a clue as to what environmental knobs we could tweak that haven't been tried already. Shaun doesn't provide any of this context. When you properly understand these arguments, the policy recommendations they advocate, while still subjective based on your political worldview, make quite a lot more sense than Shaun is suggesting. And many of the statements that Shaun dismisses as, quote, moderate hedging quotes are not in conflict with this understanding. Also, his point about employers using IQ to make hiring decisions is actually one of the best examples to demonstrate the bell curve's main thesis. IQ is the best known predictor of job performance, rivaling even work sample tests, where somebody just observes you doing the job you're trying to get hired to do. IQ is a dramatically better predictor than the standard interview, which is one of the most common screening methods. Yet with a correlation of about 0.5 with job performance, according to this study, that still means it only explains 25% of the variance in job performance. So it still leaves much of the variance unaccounted for, but it's one of the best predictive variables we have. Near the very end of his video, he again recites a quote out of context. He displays a small section of text from the book regarding heritability stating, "The state of knowledge does not permit a precise estimate." As previously discussed, he's conflating heritability estimates with a separate question of genetic contribution to between-group differences, and when the full context is provided, IQ is substantially heritable despite the lack of a, quote, precise estimate. Heritability estimates do a sufficient job at, quote, proving that IQ is influenced by genes. It doesn't prove race differences are influenced by genes, and Herrnstein and Murray acknowledge this, and the general arguments the book makes do not rest on this, as I just explained. So, to finally sum up this video, it's a bad faith critique of the bell curve which Shaun actually acknowledges. At least he's self-aware enough to realize this and provides a justification for it, as flawed as it is. He misrepresents the book itself and the state of the science in numerous ways. He fails to include the context of aggregated versus individual outcomes in regard to predictive validity and variance accounted for in socioeconomic outcomes regarding IQ. His criticisms of the G-factor are either provably wrong or irrelevant. His critiques of heritability are mostly just confused, and the arguments he makes have been thoroughly rebutted, sometimes by guys such as James Flynn that are on his side of these issues, so to speak. This is another case where his one-sided reading of the evidence can get you into trouble. In addition, he purposefully leaves a false impression that the bell curve did not provide an accurate summary of heritability by quoting a random CNN interview with Charles Murray, rather than just quoting the relevant portions of the book directly. He conflates heritability with other types of genetic evidence, leaving a false impression that the bell curve does not provide evidence for a partially genetic basis for individual IQ variation. He fails to acknowledge or represent the failure of systematic environmental interventions, which is just as important as the heritability evidence for supporting the bell curve's policy recommendations. He attempts to tear down the credibility of the regression analysis in Part 2 by using a source for this that abuses regression analysis in general and provides an almost textbook example of the sociologist's fallacy. Sibling fixed effects analysis clearly contradict the validity of these findings. And finally, he fails to mention sources such as the American Psychological Association Task Force paper, which backs up a number of the assertions made in the bell curve, instead only referencing the mainstream Science on Intelligence op-ed and dismissing it because it includes quite a few Pioneer Fund recipients. Well then, that was quite a lot of work. I have an idea that the internet at large will reference Shaun's video anytime the bell curve or even just Charles Murray is discussed. I felt there needed to be one comprehensive video on the subject that could be referenced in response. So thanks for watching, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to support this channel, I accept donations via Bitcoin. You can find my address in the description.